Alrighty, today we are going to finish up talking about psychological disorders, and then we will move on to therapy, how to treat these disorders. Alright, so we're going to start off talking about suicide, which is obviously a little bit triggering for some people, a sad topic, so we won't go into too much detail or anything. We're going to more stick to sort of rates and where it occurs the most, among which people it occurs the most, stuff like that. So some national differences are Britain, Italy, and Spain's suicide rates are a little more than half of Canada's, Australia's, and the US. And then Austria and Finland have about double the rate of Canada, Australia, and the US. Racial differences, whites and Native Americans tend to commit suicide twice as often as blacks, Hispanics, and Asians. Gender differences, this is a really key point. Women are much more likely than men to attempt suicide, but men are 2 to 4 times more likely to be successful in a suicide attempt. And so women try to commit suicide more often, but men actually follow through and are able to complete that attempt more frequently. And that's just because men use more lethal methods. So men will typically use something like a gun or jumping off a high building or something like that, whereas women will do things that could or could not result in death, like taking pills or cutting their wrists. If you don't do those properly, I guess, then that could just land you in the hospital and you would have to get your stomach pumped or, get stitches or something like that for a wrist. So that's the difference, is women are more likely to try to commit suicide, but men actually commit suicide more frequently. Age differences, we see suicide rates increase in late adulthood. The highest rates are among 45 to 65-year-olds, and the second highest among those who are 85 and older. Some other group differences, suicide rates have been much higher among the rich, the non-religious, and those who are single, widowed, or divorced. So when it comes to those who are rich, it could kind of be that relative deprivation principle or even adaptation level phenomenon, where the more you have, the less satisfying it becomes, and just getting more and more and more ends up sort of plateauing your satisfaction. And then because you can't get any additional satisfaction, you feel deprived or upset, right? As it pertains to religious people, there's a little bit of a confound there. So we know that non-religious people commit suicide more often than religious people, but some religions, I think Catholicism is one of them, believes that suicide is a sin. And so it may be that some religious people may have otherwise attempted suicide, but they don't because their religion is against it and they feel strongly about that. So that could be a confounding variable. There are others too. And then those single, widowed, or divorced really just speaks to kind of that need for social connection and intimacy that we have as human beings. And if we lack that, it can lead to depression and things like suicide. Some at-risk groups are veterans, physicians, the LGBT community, and people who have some kind of unsupportive environment. And so, of course, we know that that's a lot of the LGBT community. And then people with alcohol use disorder as well. So veterans, this is because they're exposed to so many traumatic things when they're at war, usually. So they come back with PTSD, and PTSD can be a predictor of suicide. As it pertains to physicians, apparently witnessing physical pain or trauma can actually increase your own risk of suicide. So it turns out that physicians, because they're so busy saving other people's lives, they're witnessing all of this pain and trauma, and it actually weighs on them so heavily that it can affect their own psyche and make them more prone to committing suicide or trying to. And then, like I said, if you're in an unsupportive environment, that's ostracism, right? Ostracism is being left out or pushed out of a group, kind of isolated. And that is definitely a predictor of suicide, which is why we see higher rates among the LGBT community, because they are the most frequently ostracized group of people. And then day of the week and seasonal differences. This is kind of interesting. Negative emotion increases midweek, hump day, right? So 25% of suicides occur on Wednesdays. And then they're also high in April and May. Okay, some predictors of suicide. Social suggestion can trigger suicide. So I'm sure y'all have heard of 13 Reasons Why. We saw a lot of kind of copycat suicides after that had been released. And so the argument is kind of, do we put these things out there? Is there a need for them? Or are we giving people ideas they shouldn't be having? Is it fair game to even have this conversation? Should we be having this conversation with youth? And so there's a lot of kind of controversy over whether or not shows like 13 Reasons Why should even be publicized or directed anyway. Men who were exposed to family suicide were 8 times more likely to commit suicide than non-exposed men. So what this is saying is men who had a family member that committed suicide were 8 times more likely to commit suicide themselves compared to men who did not have a family member that committed suicide. Suicidal urges typically arise when people feel disconnected from others. Remember, that's kind of like ostracism a little bit, or ostracism can feed into this, can be one type of disconnection from others. But when people feel disconnected from others and they feel like they're a burden to other people, or they feel defeated and trapped by some kind of inescapable situation. So that's kind of feeling like there's very little personal control that you have. And so the one thing I do have control over is just saying, screw this, and ending it, essentially. Suicide rates increase with unemployment during economic recessions. So again, sort of that loss of control can precipitate negative emotions. Suicidal thoughts also increase when people are driven to reach a goal or a standard and they can't reach it. So again, this is another one of those things where you're actively going towards something, you fail to do it, and then that failure is what feeds into these negative emotions that can lead to suicidal thoughts. So oftentimes this is becoming thin or straight or rich, right? Things that are not very easy to do, right? And so when you fail, people can react pretty poorly to that. How can we be helpful to someone who's talking about suicide? You can listen and empathize, of course. You can connect them with your campus counseling center, the suicide prevention lifeline, or the crisis text line. And you can always protect someone who appears to be at immediate risk. And you should protect people who appear to be at immediate risk by seeking help from a doctor, the nearest hospital emergency room, or 911. If you see someone who's standing on top of a bridge, by God, do not just stand there and look at them, right? Call for help. Do something. Someone's got to do something. Otherwise, we all fall into this bystander effect, right? And more people die than they need to. Okay. Self-injury. So, non-suicidal self-injury is painful but not fatal behaviors, like cutting or burning your skin, hitting yourself, inserting objects under your nails or skin. That one makes me so uncomfortable. And then they also say in the textbook, tattooing themselves. I put a nice question mark next to that because I'm pretty sure that most people do not go in to get a tattoo with the idea of, oh, I want to hurt but not kill myself. I strongly doubt that. Now, maybe that's something that some people with NSSI tendencies do. They get tattoos or piercings for the pain, but for the most part, that's not really typical. But what I want you to write down as it pertains to non-suicidal self-injury is that NSSI usually does not lead to suicide. It usually does not lead to suicide. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. So people who engage in non-suicidal self-injury tend to experience bullying, harassment, and other life stress, and they're generally less able to tolerate or cope with that emotional distress, regulate it. They're often extremely self-critical, struggle to communicate, solve problems, and perform academically, so they have low self-esteem. But why do they hurt themselves? And this is a really important question, and this is something that's difficult for most people to understand because it doesn't make sense to the average person. And from an evolutionary psychology perspective, it also doesn't make sense. Evolutionary psychology says we are pre-programmed to do anything that helps our survival, right? That increases our ability to survive and reproduce. And so it just is so counterintuitive when someone does something to injure themselves. And suicide is the same way. It's just so counterintuitive that for people who don't experience this, it's very hard to comprehend. But nonetheless, we have discovered some reasons that are common to a lot of NSSI sufferers. And some of these reasons are that they find relief from intense negative thoughts through the distraction of pain. So it's kind of like lessening emotional pain by producing physical pain instead. It might be to attract attention and possibly get help. So it could be kind of this silent cry for help from someone. They don't know who they can reach out to, so instead they leave a mark on themselves that would concern someone enough to actually step in and do something. Some may do it to relieve guilt by punishing themselves. Some may try to get others to change their negative behavior. So this is kind of a weird one, but if someone has been bullied a lot, they may try to self-injure in places where it's obvious so that bullies actually feel bad or feel some kind of sense of empathy and they stop criticizing or bullying them. Now, that doesn't usually work because bullies will instead pick on that and use that against you most of the time. And so I don't think that this is very common, but nonetheless, it's one that has been identified as a cause or as a reason. To fit in with a peer group, that's another weird one. And that doesn't happen, all that frequently either. But if you have friends who are doing NSSI and it's kind of this cool hip thing in your group or something like that, then I suppose it could be as a way to fit in with the peer group. But again, does it usually lead to suicide? No, it doesn't. So people who are self-injuring do not actually want to end their lives most of the time. It's for one of these above reasons where they want to keep living, but they want something in their lives to change. But NSSI is a risk factor for suicidal thoughts and future suicide attempts, especially when it coexists with bipolar disorder. Okay, moving on to schizophrenia. So schizophrenia is a psychotic disorder, and a psychotic disorder is a type of disorder that includes irrational ideas, distorted perceptions, and a loss of touch with reality. So the most common of these, like I said, is schizophrenia. And so this is characterized by delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, and diminished or inappropriate emotional expression. So we'll talk about sort of what each of these things means. But what you really need to know is the difference between positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia. This is crucial. So when you have a positive symptom of schizophrenia, you have something extra that's abnormal that other people do not have. So an example would be a hallucination. A hallucination is a false sensory experience. So a hallucination would be seeing something that isn't really there, hearing something that isn't actually there, feeling something that isn't really touching you, smelling something that isn't present, tasting a flavor that isn't present. So it's a false sensory experience. And that would be a positive symptom. That is something additional that schizophrenics have that normal functioning people do not have, right? And then a negative symptom is the absence of an appropriate behavior. So something is missing in a schizophrenic that is normally present in a typically functioning human. So a negative symptom, we're going to talk about flat affect. Flat affect is a typical symptom of schizophrenia where the person just has absolutely no emotional expression whatsoever. Their face is just totally flat. Their affect, their emotion is flat. There's no movement behind this at all. And that's abnormal, right? It is normal for people to have emotion, but this is why it's a negative symptom, because schizophrenics lack They do not have that appropriate behavior of showing emotion is absent. It's taken away. So that's how you should think about positive and negative symptoms. Positive as something being added, negative as something being taken away. So positive symptoms would be hallucinations, talking in disorganized and diluted ways, and exhibiting inappropriate laughter, tears, or rage. Those with negative symptoms might have toneless voices, expressionless faces, or mute and rigid bodies. We'll give specific words for those in just a minute too. So let's first talk about hallucinations and delusions. So people with schizophrenia have hallucinations sometimes. They see, hear, feel, taste, or smell things that exist only in their minds. And most often, this is important, most frequent hallucinations for schizophrenics are auditory. They're voices that they're hearing in their head. A lot of people think that the most frequent hallucination is visual, that you see something that isn't really there. Nope, it's auditory. Most of the time, schizophrenics hear voices inside of their heads. And sometimes these voices make insulting remarks or give orders, but sometimes they're just like another personality, floating around in your mind, kind of. Doesn't have to be threatening, but sometimes it is. Whereas a delusion is a false belief, often of persecution or grandeur, that may accompany psychotic disorders. So a delusion of persecution would be falsely believing that like the CIA is after you, right? They're coming after you, they're gonna attack you and arrest you or something like that. So that's a persecution. It's a delusion that someone is after you, someone is coming to persecute you. And then a delusion of grandeur is kind of like narcissism. So it's believing that you are way more important or you have some kind of special purpose or role that you don't really have. So some schizophrenics have delusions that they are Madonna, and they really believe with all of their heart that they are Madonna, right? And when Madonna comes on television and they're watching her sing a song, they're looking around at their friends and family and saying, how can you not tell that that's me? That's me right there. That's me. I'm Madonna, and so they really, really believe it. And even to the point sometimes where delusions manifest in hallucinations, and when they look in the mirror, they see Madonna's reflection staring back at them. I mean, these are just really intense examples, but it's possible. And these things do happen with really severe cases of schizophrenia. So what I want you to write down here is hallucinations are false sensory experiences, things you see, hear, taste, smell, feel, something that isn't actually there. But delusions are false beliefs, either about yourself or about the world. So hallucinations, false sensory experiences. Delusions, false beliefs. And again, these are both positive symptoms. These are things that are present that are not present in a normally functioning person. Schizophrenics typically also have disorganized or scattered thinking patterns. Their brains kind of jump around from place to place. And this could also be a breakdown in selective attention. So sometimes what we see is that schizophrenics are taking in absolutely everything that's going on at all times, including irrelevant stimuli. So with selective attention, I know this is from forever ago, but we talked about selective attention back in chapter 3. And selective attention is when you tune out irrelevant stuff so that you can focus on the stuff that is relevant. Well, schizophrenics can't do this. And so while they're trying to have a conversation with someone, they're hearing everybody's footsteps, everybody's voices around them. They're hearing a fan that might be blowing. They are just like so distracted by so many things that are going on because they don't have the capacity to shut those things off or turn their attention away from things that are irrelevant. Non-disordered individuals can give undivided attention to something and filter out other things, but schizophrenics have difficulty with this and are easily distracted by tiny, unrelated stimuli, like grooves on a brick or tones in a voice. Okay, so as it pertains to disorganized speech, schizophrenics typically have difficulty communicating with others. Their speech can come out scattered, it can quickly fleet from one thing to another, jump around different topics, and it's really disorganized, so it's really hard a lot of the time for people to keep up and to follow what a schizophrenic is trying to say to them. Diminished and inappropriate emotions. So this is going to be those negative symptoms. The emotions that schizophrenics express are often inappropriate, like laughing when they're recalling a death, crying when others are laughing, or becoming angry for no apparent reason. Others with schizophrenia might have a flat affect, meaning that they lack any apparent feeling or emotion at all. Most have an impaired theory of mind, so they can't really put themselves in other people's shoes or take on other people's points of views. They can't perceive facial expressions very well, and so they struggle to feel sympathy or compassion. Motor behavior is also sometimes inappropriate and disruptive. One thing is called catatonia, and catatonia is when you go absolutely still and do not move. So that would be a negative symptom, right? Because it's normal for people to be moving around. Even when they're sitting still, there's still small movements of the body that happen, right? You're tapping your finger, you're shaking your leg, or, you're cracking your fingers or something like this, right? But with schizophrenics, if they have catatonia, their whole body will go rigid, sometimes for hours. And that is, obviously disordered, right? But it can also go the other way around to compulsive actions where they're continually rocking or rubbing their arms. So that would be a positive symptom, right? Something that's present that is not present in other people. And it can even escalate to severe or dangerous agitation. But again, like we talked about yesterday, most people with psychological disorders are not aggressive or violent, but sometimes we do see violent behavior with schizophrenics, sometimes. But these symptoms profoundly disrupt the social and work relationships of the person who suffers from schizophrenia. In a supportive environment and on medication, schizophrenics can experience a year or more of normal life experience, but only 1 in 7 make a full recovery. So the recovery rate for schizophrenia is quite low. Men tend to develop schizophrenia earlier, more intensely, and more often than women. Men are also more likely to have the negative symptoms and to develop chronic schizophrenia. We're about to talk about the difference between chronic and acute. So for chronic schizophrenia, that's a form of schizophrenia where the symptoms appear by your late teenage years or early adult years. And as people age, the psychotic episodes get longer and recovery periods shorten. So basically, with chronic schizophrenia, it gets worse over time. Particularly well-adjusted people may develop acute schizophrenia after a specific life stress. And these people more often have the positive symptoms and they respond to drug therapy. So acute schizophrenia is schizophrenia that can begin at any age. It's usually right after some kind of emotionally traumatic event, and it has extended recovery periods over time. So with time, chronic schizophrenia gets worse. With time, acute schizophrenia gets better. That's important. Over time, chronic schizophrenia gets worse. Acute schizophrenia gets better. So you would rather, if you had to choose, have acute schizophrenia because you can get better as time goes on. Some brain abnormalities that go along with schizophrenia. Dopamine overactivity is one that we've seen. So schizophrenics tend to have an excess number of dopamine receptors, particularly one called D4, and that can intensify brain signals in schizophrenia and create positive symptoms. So all of that extra activity going on in a schizophrenic's brain, all of this dopamine bouncing around, is what creates hallucinations, paranoia, delusions, things like this. Because there's just so much energy and stuff going on in your brain that you're trying to make sense of it, and that tends to show itself as a hallucination or a delusion. Abnormal brain activity, anatomy. We see abnormally low brain activity in the frontal lobes in schizophrenics. Remember that the frontal lobes have to do with decision-making, planning, judgment, self-control, stuff like that. So it makes sense that schizophrenics have lower activity in their frontal lobes since they do act a little bit more childlike than most normally functioning people. In PET scans during hallucinations, the thalamus and the amygdala are vigorously active. So we see a lot of activity in the thalamus and the amygdala when a person is experiencing a hallucination. But we see smaller than normal areas of the brain in the cortex, the hippocampus, the corpus callosum, and the thalamus as well. Okay, prenatal environment. So some risk factors for schizophrenia are a low birth weight. If you're born very, very light, so you don't weigh very much when you're born. If your mom has diabetes, that can be a risk factor for schizophrenia. The older that your father is, the more risk of you developing schizophrenia. So the older your father is when you are conceived, that is, the more risk you have of developing schizophrenia. And then oxygen deprivation while you are being born during your delivery can also lead to schizophrenia. Those who were conceived during a time of famine are also 2 times more likely to develop schizophrenia. And fetal virus infections contribute to the development of schizophrenia as well. So if you get some kind of viral infection while you're a fetus inside your mother's womb, that can predict the development of schizophrenia. Genetic factors. So there's a 1 in 100 chance of any person being diagnosed with schizophrenia, but that turns into a 1 in 10 chance among people who have a sibling or a parent with the disorder. That's pretty significant, right? 1 in 100 goes down to 1 in 10 if you've got a sibling or a parent with the disorder. It goes down to 1 in 2 if you have a twin who's schizophrenic. Some genes influence the effects of dopamine and other neurotransmitters, and others affect the production of myelin, and epigenetic factors influence whether genes will be expressed at all. And then some environmental triggers. We've actually found no environmental causes that will, invariably every single time, or even with moderate probability, produce schizophrenia in people who are not related to someone with schizophrenia. So we really haven't found any reliable environmental causes for schizophrenia. But some possible early warning signs would be social withdrawal or other abnormal behavior, having a mother whose schizophrenia was severe and long-lasting, birth complications, short attention span, poor muscle coordination, disruptive or withdrawn behavior, emotional unpredictability, poor peer relations, and childhood abuse. So if you see any of these signs while someone is young, that is a cue that you should be on the lookout for the possible development of schizophrenia later. Okay. This is my favorite part of the entire semester, dissociative disorders. So, this is so exciting. Dissociative disorders are controversial and rare disorders where your conscious awareness becomes separated from your previous memories, thoughts, and feelings. So, a dissociation in particular is a separation. That's all that it means. A dissociation is a separation. And so when we're talking about a dissociative disorder, we're talking about a dissociation where your physical self separates from your mental self. Your conscious awareness separates from your physical body, or it separates from any previous memories, thoughts, and feelings that you've had. And so what tends to happen here is dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality disorder. So this is a split or a separation in personalities within a person. So yes, like I said, dissociation is separation. This can happen to everyone. So an example is driving somewhere and then you get there and you really don't have any memory of the drive. So just kind of that when you wander off and you're not really consciously aware of what's going on, that's a dissociation that's natural. That's one that everybody experiences from time to time. But when it's constant or when it's within your personality, now it's something that's disordered, right? It interferes with your day-to-day living. So the result may involve a fugue state, which is a sudden loss of memory or a change in identity. And this is often in response to an overwhelmingly stressful situation. So typically stress, some kind of overwhelming trauma or stress triggers that dissociation to happen, triggers more than one personality to branch off and develop within one person, which is dissociative identity disorder. This used to be called multiple personality disorder. And this is rare. It's controversial. People don't know if it is really real or not. I'm going to give you some pretty convincing evidence that it is. But a person exhibits at least two, maybe more distinct and alternating personalities. The two or more personalities have their own voices, their own mannerisms, and they seem to control a person's behavior at different times. Usually, the original personality is not aware that the other personalities exist, but sometimes the other personalities are aware of one another, and all of the personalities tend to be aware of the original personality, usually. Again, these are really rare. We find it very hard to find people who actually have this, who we can study in the first place, but these are the patterns that we've discovered with the data that we do have. People with dissociative identity are rarely violent, but some cases have been reported of a good and a bad personality within a person. Okay, so skeptics question dissociative identity. They say, well, maybe this isn't really a disorder. Maybe this is just an extension of our normal capacity to shift personalities. So, in some situations, like with our friends, we're going to act loud and sociable, but then we're quiet and we're subdued in class. So maybe it's more just an exaggerated version of sort of pretending, basically. Are dissociative identity patients just highly susceptible to suggestion and they get too involved in role playing? That's another thing that skeptics try to ask. And then the discovery of dissociative identity disorder is relatively new, and it is not very prevalent outside of North America. So that's another reason, because we don't see it worldwide, that people question whether or not it is in fact real. Sometimes therapists go fishing for multiple personalities. With really vulnerable people who have experienced some kind of trauma, they're usually very open to suggestion. And so if your therapist is doing all of the wrong things that they should not have been trained to do, they might try to kind of talk you into saying that there's another personality there that otherwise you wouldn't have ever brought up. And when people, like I said, are very vulnerable, this can work, and they can actually believe their therapist and believe that there is another personality hiding in there, and that really just does create more anxiety for them usually. But other researchers and clinicians believe that it's a real disorder. We do see distinct body and brain states associated with different personalities. So when you have someone in like a PET scan or something like that, and they shift personalities, the brain pathways that light up in their head change. The pathways change entirely. It is absolutely different, distinct neural networks that work when each personality is in control of the person. Brain scans show shrinkage in areas that aid memory and detection of threats, but there's heightened activity in the brain areas associated with control and inhibition of traumatic memories. And so what this kind of speaks to is that dissociative identity disorder is something that develops as a result from trauma. And so they have heightened activity in the brain areas that inhibit traumatic memories. So they're trying to get rid of that trauma, and that's kind of the theory why a personality would split off and develop besides just the original one. Both psychodynamic and learning perspectives believe that dissociative identity symptoms are ways of coping with anxiety. Others think it's a form of PTSD. And then here's just an article that you can read if you want to. It's actually very interesting, but I'm going to tell you a little bit of what's in here. So, this is the really convincing evidence for dissociative identity disorder. And I'm a little disappointed that they don't talk about this more in the textbook. They kind of leave it alone, but this is sort of my area of real interest. So, one thing is that two personalities within the same person can have different allergies. So if I'm both Sarah and Jane, let's say, and Sarah is allergic to bees, but Jane is not, if I'm Sarah and I get stung by a bee, I'm going to have an allergic reaction. But if I switch over to the personality of Jane while I'm having the allergic reaction stops dead. It's as if I was not even allergic. So my whole body chemistry actually changes in response to a shift of personality, to the extent of one personality being allergic to something that another personality isn't. That's crazy. Another thing is the reappearance and disappearance of scars. So if Sarah has a scar that Jane doesn't have, when I switch over to Sarah, that scar will physically appear on my skin and raise up out of nowhere. But then when I switch back to Jane, it fades back into my skin and blends back in, and there's no raised skin anymore. So if that isn't some pretty convincing evidence that dissociative identity disorder is real, I don't know what else could be, because I can't imagine that it's just like a mind over matter type thing where, someone could tell themselves, oh, I'm not going to have an allergic reaction right now. That doesn't make sense, right? But of course, it doesn't really make sense the other way around. It doesn't really make sense why someone might have multiple personalities or how they function with multiple personalities. But one thing I want you to write down under this question is, so this question asks, what evidence is there in support of dissociative identity as a real disorder? And I want you to write down these 3 things. I want you to write down allergies, brain activity patterns, and scars. Allergies, brain activity patterns, and scars. Personality disorders. So these are inflexible and enduring behavior patterns that impair social functioning. So it's not that you have a disorder where your personality changes or something like that, but it's a disorder where your personality in and of itself is harmful or is impairing your social functioning. So who you are as a person is actually disordered. That's what we're talking about with personality disorders. And so there are 3 clusters of these disorders in the DSM. The first cluster has to do with anxiety. So having a fearful sensitivity to rejection, that can be an example of avoidant personality disorder. But the first cluster is those that relate to anxiety. The second cluster relates to eccentric or odd behaviors, like the emotional disengagement of schizotypal personality disorder. And then lastly, dramatic or impulsive behaviors, like borderline personality disorder, which is mostly focused on acquiring attention from other people. Narcissistic personality disorder, which has to do with sort of self-focused and self-inflating beliefs. And then antisocial personality disorder. Next to antisocial personality disorder, I want you to write down sociopath or psychopath, because that is what antisocial personality disorder is. The word sociopath or psychopath is actually not a real word for a classification of a disorder. Instead, the proper word for sociopath or psychopath is antisocial personality disorder. So let's talk about that. Antisocial personality disorder is a disorder where the person, who is usually a man, exhibits a lack of conscience for wrongdoing, even towards friends and family members. They might be aggressive and ruthless, or they could be a clever con artist. So really, the main issue with antisocial personality disorder is the lack of sympathy, compassion, or empathy. We really just do not care about other people. You don't have the propensity to feel empathy or compassion for another person if you have antisocial personality disorder. And so the lack of conscience becomes pretty obvious before the age of 15. These children tend to lie, steal, cheat, or display unrestrained sexual behavior if they have APD. People with APD are sometimes called sociopaths or psychopaths, and they have low emotional intelligence. So like I said, an inability to empathize or sympathize, show compassion. Low emotional intelligence. That also goes into understanding other people's emotions, managing their own emotions, perceiving other people's emotions. And antisocial personalities behave impulsively. They feel and they fear very little, and they usually don't experience regret. So molecular geneticists have identified some specific genes that are more common in people with APD. People with APD tend to express low arousal in response to threats, so they really just are not fearful. That's a big part of it, is that people with antisocial personality disorder are not fearful, and they usually have very, very high pain tolerances. So they're not fearful, and they don't typically experience pain. They also have lower levels of stress hormones too. Preschool boys who later become aggressive or antisocial adolescents tended to be impulsive, uninhibited, unconcerned with social rewards, and low in anxiety while they were that young in preschool. So we do see symptoms of APD very, very young in children. Fearlessness and dominance can be adaptive if it's used constructively, but those are typical characteristics of someone with APD. Genetic influences, often in combination with negative environmental factors like childhood abuse, family instability, poverty, help to wire the brain in such a way so as to develop APD. People with antisocial criminal tendencies have a smaller amygdala and less active frontal lobes compared to normal functioning people. And really, that smaller amygdala could relate to why they're so fearless, because the amygdala is so closely tied with feeling fear. So having a smaller amygdala could explain why there's less fear that these people experience. The genes that put people at risk for APD also put people at risk for substance use disorders. So these things kind of occur together, usually. And people with APD tend to have hyperreactive dopamine reward systems. So this actually predisposes them to do impulsive things that are rewarding regardless of the consequences. Okay. Last section, we're going to talk about eating disorders. So in anorexia, this is an eating disorder where a person, usually an adolescent female, maintains a starvation diet despite being significantly underweight. And this is sometimes accompanied by things like excessive exercise or laxative use or something like that to actually lose more weight. But the most characteristic thing about anorexia is that this person is not eating. They are not eating. Or they're not eating enough. You know, if they are eating, it's like a piece of bread a day, something like that. Now, bulimia is an eating disorder where a person binge eats, so they eat a lot of high-calorie foods, and then they do something to purge all of those calories that they've just taken in. So usually that comes across as vomiting. That's the most common thing that we associate with bulimia usually. But it can also be laxative use, fasting, or excessive exercise. And then binge eating disorder is where someone has that same binge as a bulimic, right? So they eat a bunch of really high calorie foods, but then afterward they just feel stressed, disgusted, guilty, but they don't do anything to actually try to lose that weight. So if you've ever watched something like, I think it's My 600-Pound Life on TLC, all of those people who are on that show struggle with binge eating disorder. They eat way too much, and then they feel upset, distressed, guilty for doing it, but they don't do anything to fix the problem. They don't do anything to actually lose weight. So what I want you to write down here is sort of the key differences between these three. So next to anorexia, I want you to write down eats little to nothing, may or may not attempt to lose more weight. Someone who's anorexic eats little to nothing, and they may or may not attempt to lose more weight. Someone with bulimia eats a lot and then purges. Eats a lot and then purges. And purging can be throwing up, excessive exercise, laxative use, all those things. And then binge eating, this person eats a lot and then feels bad but does nothing to lose the weight. Eats a lot and then feels bad but does nothing to lose the weight. 0.6% of Americans meet the criteria for anorexia. That's pretty low. 1% for bulimia, 2.8% for binge eating disorder. Anorexia and bulimia are the most harmful, and that can result in a shorter life expectancy, mostly just because you're damaging your health so much, and a greater risk of suicide and non-suicidal self-injury. So here are kind of some facts about eating disorders that help us to understand how and why and where and in who they occur. So eating disorders are not a telltale sign of childhood sexual abuse, but families and family dynamics can have an influence on the development of an eating disorder. So families of people who have anorexia tend to be competitive, high achieving, and protective. Those with eating disorders often have low self-evaluations, so low self-esteem, and they set these perfectionist standards. They fret about not meeting those expectations, and they're intensely concerned with the way that other people perceive and view them. Identical twins share these disorders more often than fraternal twins, and so having a gene that reduces available serotonin adds about 30% to a person's risk of anorexia or bulimia. Some cultural and gender effects include, in impoverished countries, heavier people are seen as more prosperous because they have the financial access to get food, and so bigger is actually better in these countries. We see less or fewer eating disorders in impoverished countries and many more eating disorders in food-abundant countries. In Western cultures, we value being thin and fit. And so the people who are most vulnerable to eating disorders are those who idealize thinness and have the greatest body dissatisfaction. And this is usually women and gay men. Peer influences like teasing also matter. 2 in 3 women with anorexia or bulimia recover when they seek treatment, so the recovery rate is actually pretty high. And we can prevent these disorders by encouraging people to accept their bodies. So by sort of purporting this positive body image message and also sort of debunking these myths about, how perfectly proportioned models are or something like that. Just encouraging people to accept their bodies and not be too idealistic in their desires for their bodies can encourage them to not go down the road of developing an eating disorder. All right, that's the end. So make sure you turn in this worksheet and the quiz, and then we will have one more session, and then Dr. Lawrence will be sending out an announcement tonight about an extra credit assignment that you get to do. So kind of scored you some extra credit there a little bit. So make sure you take a look at that, and other than that, have a good one.